Hello, everybody. It's me. The reason you're seeing a black screen is because there will be no need for video for this video, if that makes any sense. Because I'm only going to be demonstrating why MP3 isn't as viable as you might think. Let's go. What you just heard is going to be very essential to this video. That was a nice little tune made by a YouTuber named Casey Connor, but I'm not going to go into detail about him because it's irrelevant to this video. The point is, what you just heard is a song that he made at 192 kilobytes per second for bit rate and 48 kilohertz for sample rate. Now keep in mind there is a difference between bit rate and sample rate. 192 kilobytes per second at 48 kilohertz is the general standard. That's pretty much as high as YouTube goes as well. Now, you can go higher in both of these, but in the case of an MP3, it would be useless because you can't really tell any difference afterwards, and it still cuts off higher frequency sounds. That's one of the things that MP3 is actually very notorious for, is cutting off sounds when they shouldn't be cut off. That's why some sounds on MP3s can have this little effect to them. But not only that, the program that I used to fiddle around with the bitrate and sample rate to make this video, not KineMaster itself, but a program that I used outside of KineMaster to fiddle with the sound, does not allow anything beyond 48 kilohertz when it comes to MP3 encoding. So that's kind of moot anyways. Now what you just heard is the same bit rate as before, but with a slightly lower sample rate. Instead of it being 48 kilohertz, it's at 44.1, which was the general standard like 10 or 20 years ago. Now, that might not seem like much of a difference, but there are actually people like sound experts who are very in tune with stuff like bitrate and sample rate and can tell even the most minute differences. Now, this next example is going to have pretty much the same thing in common, but instead of it being a very small drop in sample rate, it is going to be a very small drop in bit rate. Once again, the difference between the example here and the first example is very small, and it would take someone with a very good developed sense of hearing and training with said hearing to notice anything different. Now, you might be wondering why the sample rate is all the way up to there to 48 kilohertz when humans can only hear up to 20 kilohertz. Is because sound frequency and sample frequency are different things. Sound only it's only measured by the frequency of the sound itself. Sample rate, on the other hand, is how many times that sound comes out of a speaker. It's kind of analogous to the refresh rate of a television screen or whatever device you're using. Because the program that I used doesn't have a 20 kilohertz sample rate, I had to use 16 because it was within human hearing range. And here's what happens when the sample rate is only at that level within human hearing range. Now, some of you probably didn't hear it, but the high-pitched musical sound, let's just call it a whistle. Yeah, it sounds like a whistle to me. So, anyways, in this example, the whistle had an overlay on top of it, almost like a distortion. This is called an alias. I don't know for sure what causes it, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the sample rate being within human hearing range. And also, for those of you who don't know the difference between bitrate and sample rate is how much information is being put into the file, and sample rate is how quickly that information is being broadcast into the air for you to hear. Essentially, bitrate is how much, sample rate is how many. Now, while bitrate and sample rate may have a technical difference, if one is really low while the other is really high, it will still have essentially the same result: crappy sound. Let's take a listen at what happens if you have a really high bit rate but a really low sample rate. Now, this was an obvious deviation from the first example. The bass was no longer as full, and the high notes of the whistles, well, they kinda just disappeared from the face of the earth. The reason for this is because the sample rate, being at only 8,000 hertz, it basically just means that anything higher pitched than that, sound-wise, would no longer register. So then what happens if you reverse it? Low bit rate, high sample rate. Well, you get something kind of similar. Let's take a listen. Essentially the same result, right? The bass is no longer rich and full, and the high-pitched notes for the whistle, well, they're still there, but they're really warbly and watery sounding, almost like a vocoder. Now, essentially what's happening with these two examples here is in the previous example, you're basically taking a huge amount of information and crushing it down into a single point until it collapses in on itself like a black hole, and you get a very muffled mess. And in this case, you're taking a very small amount of information and forcibly stretching it out until its limbs rip off. Wow, that took a dark turn, didn't it? Anyways, now there is actually a way that you can get a lower bit rate than 128 kilobytes per second and a sample rate of less than 48 kilohertz and still have good sound. In fact, most CDs have this very same specification: less than average bit rate, less than average sample rate. Let's have a listen. Now, there is actually an upside to having CD quality audio. Not only is it a less than average bit rate and sample rate and still sounds pretty good, it's also a smaller file size. Oh, and speaking of file size, one of the previous examples, the one with the really high bit rate with the really small sample rate, yeah, don't ever do that. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of storage, and it sounds like crap. Like I said before, you're basically taking a huge amount of information and cramming it down and only allowing a little itty-bitty portion of that huge file size to be audible, which is bad. And now to end on a final note, what happens if it's a low bit rate and a low sample rate? Two upsides and two downsides. Upsides are low file size and, well, the quality fits the quantity. Unfortunately, it is still low quality and low quantity, so it's not going to be very clear, although fortunately it's not going to be a warbled out mess either. Here, have a listen. Still doesn't sound as bad as the other examples, where it was the low bitrate only and the low sample rate only, but the high-pitched notes have still been kinda cut off. Now, back to the first example. The reason I went on this whole tangent about the bit rate and sample rate and blah 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 isn't just for education, but it's also for my own central point that mp3s aren't really that good a way of, having music. Even at the so-called average level of quality, it's still kinda bad. Even with the average bitrate and sample rate, it's still noticeably low quality to some. And even if you give it the maximum bitrate and the maximum sample rate, you're basically just gonna get a worse WAV file. It's gonna be about the same size as one, with only a tenth of the quality. On the other hand, you could also have really low bit rate and really low sample rate, and, well, bad. So while MP3s aren't really the best way to make media, they are the most common besides, like, their own upgrade, the MP4, as well as MIDI files. On the plus side, though, they are universal, and anything with a 16-bit operating system or better can play one. Well, if they have the codec for it, of course. And that's pretty much the point that I was trying to make. MP3s are useful, but not the best. That's it. Now that we're done, I'm to just sit back and listen to some nice music.